Welcome to the deep dive. If you've ever wondered what truly separates, the calculatingly cold from the genuinely compassionate, you've definitely hit the right place.
Absolutely.
Today, we're not just talking philosophy, we are strapping in for a deep dive into the very core architecture of the brain. We're exploring one of the most fascinating and, frankly, chilling aspects of human behavior, psychopathy.
And specifically, this one tiny almond-shaped region that seems to be responsible for setting our moral boundaries, the amygdala.
Right, the amygdala.
And this is a deep dive where the science, it really confronts the philosophical questions
Yeah.
head on. Our sources are analyzing a crucial question that just cuts through all the simple definitions of morality.
Which is a psychopath someone who just chooses to be ruthless?
Sure.
Or is the answer, deeper?
Exactly. Does it lie in a misfiring circuit or maybe even a structural deficit in the brain itself? We're going to spend a good amount of time today detailing how this small but incredibly powerful brain region dictates not just our fear, but our entire capacity for emotional bonding.
Okay, so before we get into the really wild stuff, let's just unpack the anatomy first. The region we're talking about, the amygdala, it's physically named after the Greek word for almond.
Yeah, because of its shape.
Right. It's just a pair of dense, tiny nuclei buried deep within the temporal lobes, one on each side. I mean, physically, it's not impressive in size at all, but its influence is just staggering.
Staggering is absolutely the right word, because while it's small, its responsibilities are enormous. In let's call it a neurotypical brain, the amygdala is fundamentally the central emotional processing center.
The hub.
It's the hub. It's most famous for governing our sort of primal emotion of fear, that fight or flight response, but to limit it to just fear is a miss, like half the story.
Right, because our sources really highlight its role in complex social navigation. It's almost like the brain's instantaneous risk assessment engine.
Precisely. It doesn't just evaluate physical threats like, I don't know, a charging bear or something.
Yeah.
It helps us navigate the much, much trickier territory of social threat.
So, like reading people's faces?
Yeah. Yes. For example, it's the structure that helps you instantly recognize and process fear or distress or even pain in another person's face. When you see someone recoil in horror, your amygdala rapidly processes those facial cues, and it instantly creates this internal, often visceral echo of that emotion.
That's the key linkage, isn't it? That echo.
It is.
The amygdala makes their fear your problem, at least for a second. It helps with everything from these complex moral decisions like, should I step in and help, to just basic social behavior.
Without that instant emotional resonance, the gravity of another person's suffering would just be, well, it would be abstract, just data.
Just a fact.
It acts as the central hub for what you could call emotional consequence mapping.
Ah.
It provides the necessary emotional feedback that determines whether a behavior is morally okay or not.
So that pang of guilt you feel, or that immediate rush of protective concern for a child, or even the deep warmth of connection with a friend.
All of that relies on the amygdala's activity. It essentially dictates the emotional scaffolding of our entire social world. It's constantly assessing who is worthy of our protection and what behavior demands an emotional response from us.
Okay, so now here's where this deep dive gets completely counterintuitive, because to understand how it works, we first have to look at what happens when it's just gone.
Right. And our source material introduces this profound paradox by comparing two drastically different scenarios.
Two scenarios involving damage or dysfunction of this one little structure.
And we start with scenario one, total amygdala damage. And let me be clear, this is not psychopathy. This is something else entirely.
This is the result of like severe trauma or a disease or maybe even surgical removal.
A complete structural wiping out of those almond-shaped nuclei. They're just not there.
And the research outcome is, well, it's almost the exact opposite of what you might assume. You'd think losing your fear center would make you into a cold, fearless Terminator, right?
You would think that.
Yeah.
But instead, these individuals, they lose the ability to distinguish between a friend and a stranger, between a threat and an ally.
It's just gone, that filter.
That's the startling effect.
Well,
They become what researchers call radically open. They lose their capacity for healthy suspicion. They become highly gullible, completely unable to accurately sense danger or threat or betrayal from other people.
so that little voice in your head that says, wait a second, this seems too good to be true.
It's silent. The system that dictates, hang on, this person might hurt me or use me, it just goes completely quiet.
I find that so fascinating. I mean, if I meet someone new, My functioning amygdala is running all these subconscious calculations, right? It's judging their microexpressions, cataloging inconsistencies in their story, assessing their body language for deceit. It's drawing boundaries.
Absolutely.
So if that entire mechanism is gone, how does that actually affect their day-to-day decisions?
It paralyzes their ability to discriminate based on emotional input. So if they're offered a highly risky financial deal by a complete stranger, they don't experience that instinctive red flag.
No gut feeling.
No gut feeling. None of that spike of fear or suspicion that a neurotypical person would. They treat the stranger with the exact same unfiltered level of trust they would give to, say, their own mother.
Wow. So because they lack the emotional data, they can't create these essential emotional divisions between people.
Exactly. When the central mechanism for emotional discrimination is completely offline, the default setting appears to be a kind of universal, unconditional acceptance. They can't create an us versus them divide based on risk or emotional history.
The world just collapses into one big, undifferentiated group of people.
It does. Since they lack the ability to sense a threat, they treat everyone as belonging to one of us. And you can imagine this lack of self-protective paranoia is it's catastrophic in a complex social world.
Okay, that sets up the paradox beautifully. So let's pivot, and pivot hard, to the reality of psychopathy. Scenario 2, the no one is us phenomenon. So if total structural loss leads to this universal trusting acceptance, what on earth happens in the psychopathic brain where the structure is there, but the behavior is, well, it's cold, calculated, total exploitation?
This contrast right here, this is the entire intellectual core of this deep dive. Because in psychopathy, we shift from total structural damage to a structure that is present, but it's highly underactive, and critically, it's miswired.
And the behavior is the complete opposite of radical openness.
It's the antithesis. It results in a kind of radical closedness, a profound self-interest.
The total focus on me.
Precisely. For the psychopath, that emotional classification system isn't universally accepting, it's universally utilitarian. Others are just stripped of their intrinsic value. They're not fellow humans with needs or feelings or dignity.
They're just tools.
They are functionally viewed as resources, as tools, means to an end. They exist only to serve the psychopath's objectives, whether that's money, status, or just simple psychological gratification.
So that gives us the stunning contrast. People with no amygdala at all, structurally absent, they treat everyone as us.
Right.
But psychopaths, whose amygdala is present but just dysfunctional, they treat no one as us.
No one.
This implies that the psychopathic brain isn't just turning off emotion, it's specifically breaking the mechanism that generates the very concept of we.
And that raises this profound scientific and moral question, right? What specific emotional processing function is required to create that internal circle of us?
What makes a we?
What makes a we? And the answer, according to the research, isn't just whether the structure is there or not. It's the quality and the strength of its output. When the amygdala fails in this one particular way, this misfiring we're about to get into, the ability to form emotional bonds is, it seems, structurally preempted.
So the circuit that's supposed to generate that feeling of shared humanity?
It just never achieves liftoff.
So without that essential sense of we, the emotional landscape is naturally completely focused on me. And if your brain doesn't tell you that someone else's pain matters, then logically they're just another resource on the table.
To be used, manipulated, and discarded. It's a terrifyingly elegant explanation for their behavior. It really takes this concept of empathy and grounds it completely in neurobiology.
It's not just a personality trait.
Not at all. It's a failure of a specific, small biological mechanism to fire correctly.
All right, let's ground this in the hard science then. We've established the functional paradox, but the research also gives us measurable structural differences. This isn't just a philosophical thing, you can actually measure it.
That's right. I mean, while the functional misfiring is really the centerpiece for the behavior, the structural difference gives us a starting point. And our sources highlight some key findings, notably the 2009 study by Dr. Yang and colleagues, which actually quantified this physical variance.
And the data point that always gets everyone's attention is that the amygdala in psychopathic subjects is approximately 18% smaller than in the average population.
18%.
When we're talking about a core emotional processing center in the brain, 18% is not a subtle difference.
It is substantial. I mean, if you take any emotional processing structure and you just reduce its volume by almost a fifth, you would absolutely expect some degree of functional deficit.
But, and this is where you, as the representative for our listener, you have to press the scientific point here.
Okay, all right, I'm challenging the data. If it's 18% smaller, Why don't psychopaths behave more like the people with total damage? If total damage leads to this radical openness and gullibility, why does a slightly smaller structure lead to this highly functional, calculating, manipulative coldness? The behavioral outcome is completely different.
That right there is the crucial distinction. It validates this entire deep dive. The difference lies in the definition of damage versus dysfunction.
Okay, explain that. The problem in psychopathy isn't that the structure is gone or even entirely offline. It's that it is misfiring. It's structurally compromised, sure, but its remaining function is severely abnormal, particularly when it's processing external emotional data.
So if the amygdala is an emotional engine, total damage is like the engine's been completely removed from the car.
Right. And the car is radically easy to steal from. It has no capacity or self-protection.
That's psychopathy.
Psychopathy is like the engine is still there, but it's severely mistuned and miswired. It runs and allows for cognitive function, but the signals it sends are either useless or just totally distorted, especially the signals related to hazard and social risk. The key scientific finding here is this emotional response failure.
Let's get specific on that. What does the research actually show when you put a psychopath into an fMRI machine and show them, distressing images?
It's pretty stark. When you present them with stimuli that would normally evoke fear or sadness or signs of extreme physical pain in others, stimuli that would cause a massive surge of activity in a typical amygdala, the psychopathic amygdala remains largely quiet.
It's quiescent.
Quiescent. It registers the image, so the cognitive centers know what they're seeing, but the emotional monitoring system registers a near-zero emotional charge. They just stay calm.
So while I might feel a spike of panic or sympathy seeing a scene of distress, their internal system just stays neutral. The event doesn't register as emotionally significant or personally relevant at all.
Exactly. And this profound, almost terrifying calm is what enables their predatory effectiveness. They can inflict pain, or they can witness intense suffering without that internal mechanism, guilt, shame, self-reproach, or even just emotional fatigue kicking in to stop them.
They can exploit suffering precisely because they aren't hampered by that emotional drag that slows down the rest of us.
They can focus purely on the objective.
So the 18% size difference, it might contribute to the weakness of the signal, but the real catastrophe is the quality of the signal. And that quality, as our source material stresses, depends on the amygdala's partners.
Absolutely. The amygdala isn't a solo performer. It's part of a highly complex, interconnected neural orchestra. Its outputs are only as useful as the structures they communicate with.
And the research points to one connection in particular.
Consistently. It points to the lack of proper functional connections with the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. This dysfunctional wiring, this broken communication line between the amygdala and the PFC is, scientifically speaking, arguably the most important element in explaining psychopathy. Maybe even more so than the 18% size difference itself.
The prefrontal cortex, that's the CEO of the brain, right? The
Right.
region that handles executive function, planning, rationality, impulse control. It's kind of the highest level of human consciousness.
Yes. The PFC is responsible for taking that raw emotional data provided by the amygdala and translating it into long-term planning, moral judgment, and socially appropriate behavior. It's the system that says, I really want to do that, but the consequences will be X, Y, and Z, and I'll feel guilt about it, so maybe I shouldn't.
So if the amygdala is supplying weak or distorted or maybe completely non-existent emotional data, specifically the data about guilt or fear of consequence or empathy for others, then the PFC, which has to make the moral decision, is operating with a massive information deficit. It's like it's flying blind emotionally.
It's making cold, purely rational decisions, completely unfiltered by what we would call a conscience.
And that's the mechanism.
It's precisely the mechanism. And think about the impact of that broken circuit. They still have high cognitive function. They can distinguish between people. They can read social situations, which is why they're not gullible like the total damage case. They could be highly intelligent and socially perceptive.
So they understand social rules intellectually. They know that causing severe emotional distress to a colleague is wrong in the abstract social rulebook.
But they do not emotionally care that it is wrong. It's a purely transactional understanding of morality. There's no feeling attached.
It's a profound deficit in what's called the affective component.
Exactly. They get the what of social consequence. They know the rule set, but they completely lack the why. They lack the internal enforcing feeling that makes the rules matter to the rest of us. They know if they steal, they might go to jail, and they'll take steps to avoid that outcome, but they don't feel the emotional distress of the person they stole from.
So this broken circuit really explains the core behaviors of psychopathy. Because they don't have that internal emotional constraint, they are exceptional at manipulation. They can analyze a social situation, calculate the exact emotional response required to deceive or exploit someone.
And then execute that strategy without any internal friction from guilt or stress. It's effortless for them.
Which allows them to maintain a calculated long-term strategy of manipulation that would just exhaust or emotionally paralyze a neurotypical person.
They aren't burdened by emotional labor or regret. And that makes this dysfunctional wiring, the breakdown of the amygdala PFC circuit, the definitive element. It transforms a potential structural weakness into a ruthless functional advantage in their pursuit of objectives.
They have a perfectly functional social map, but the map has a corrupted, silent moral compass.
A silent compass. That's a great way to think about it.
This also answers my earlier question about why they are so calculated and not just impulsive. The POC, the planning center, is still working. It's working just fine.
It's working overtime, in fact.
Right.
But it's only processing self-interest because it's getting no signals from the emotional center that would introduce complexity or, moral hazard.
It's hyper-rational.
It is often hyper-rational
Right.
because the decision-making process is so streamlined, it only has one variable.
Right.
What's in it for me? And that allows for extraordinary effectiveness in planning and execution, which makes them, in some environments, highly successful, at least until their lack of remorse eventually catches up to them.
Okay, let's try to pull this complex brain science back into the context of everyday life for our listener. Because for most of us, our brain is constantly performing this complex, nuanced social calculus. It's how we organize our entire world, and the functional amygdala is key to all of this mapping.
Absolutely. The survival of any social species, really, relies on quick, accurate social mapping. Who's safe? Who's a threat? Who is valuable to the group? We categorize others constantly. And these aren't just abstract labels. They're profound emotional judgments built on the signals the amygdala provides.
It's the mechanism that creates the protective layers around us. We perform these deep emotional assessments all the time. Who is close enough that I would risk my life for them? Who is a colleague I respect? Who is a stranger I should be wary of?
That's the social emotional map in action. And those judgments, they determine whether we deploy resources or protection or compassion. Consider the vast emotional difference in how a typical brain treats a mother versus a dependent child or a long-term friend versus a complete abstract stranger on the other side of the planet.
These classifications require the brain to assign these different levels of emotional saliency, risk, and protection.
And they're essential because they dictate the boundaries of our morality. We treat people inside our immediate us, circle our family, our close friends, with a dramatically different set of rules than we apply to a distant acquaintance or a rival.
The amygdala and its circuits are what ensures that these social categories carry real emotional weight. It ensures the baby in the room triggers a fierce protective response,
Whereas a rival might trigger a cautious, competitive response. It's precise classification based on perceived emotional risk and connection.
Okay, so the psychopathic brain, with that dysfunctional amygdala and that broken circuit to the PFC, it lacks this essential social-emotional mapping entirely.
The failure is structural, and it is profound. They do not form those deep protective attachments because their neural machinery is incapable of generating the necessary emotional saliency required to move a person from the category of stranger resource.
Into loved one protected entity.
Exactly. It's not a rejection of bonding. It's an inability to generate the feeling of connection that is a bond.
I think that's probably the most chilling synthesis of this whole thing. The core deficit is that they cannot biologically generate the feeling of we. They only operate within the framework of me.
And that explains the universality of their utilitarian view of other human beings. If there is no biological, emotional mechanism recognizing a shared humanity, if that us boundary is non-existent, then every single person defaults to the status of a tool.
Their utility is the only measure of their value.
And they can be discarded the moment that utility runs out. No remorse, no second thought.
It's the ultimate reduction of human interaction to pure, unadulterated transactional utility, enforced by a calm, calculating prefrontal cortex that is receiving zero emotional warning signals.
Which leads us directly to the overall conclusion synthesized from our source material. It frames the amygdala as much, much more than just a simple fear sensor. This tiny almond-shaped structure is legitimately described as one of the most powerful engines of human morality.
That really puts the 18% size reduction and the dysfunctional wiring into a powerful context. Its function is what grants us the capacity to draw those moral lines, lines of protection, lines of empathy, and boundaries of acceptable social behavior.
And we see the duality perfectly demonstrated in our two extreme scenarios. When the amygdala is absent, completely gone, we embrace everyone. We lack the mechanism to fear or discriminate, and that results in vulnerability.
But when the amygdala is malfunctioning, the specific circuit is miswired and the emotional response is silent.
We exploit everyone. We lack the mechanism to feel connection, guilt, or remorse. The subtle difference in the quality of that one signal is the difference between radical vulnerability and ruthless manipulation.
It really emphasizes that the very mechanism that lets us sense physical threat is completely tied to the mechanism that allows us to sense moral obligation and connection.
Without the ability to detect emotional consequence, the capacity for care is simply absent.
Which brings us back to that initial fascinating challenge to the premise. Are psychopaths just choosing to be bad? The research seems to suggest the choice is built upon a profound neurological reality.
They're operating with a different set of inputs. They are fundamentally missing the emotional data stream that defines morality for the rest of us. It shifts the focus from, say, a moral failure to a neurological deficit.
Which doesn't lessen the real-world impact of their behaviors, of course.
Not at all. But what it does is provide a tangible physiological explanation for the social catastrophe that psychopathy represents. The lack of effective empathy isn't a personality quirk. It's a measurable failure in communication between the emotional center and the executive function center.
And it suggests that all of us who experience guilt or shame, who find ourselves unable to execute a manipulative plan because the emotional toll is just too high.
We have our functioning amygdala to thank for that inherent friction.
That internal resistance is what preserves our morality.
It is the internal enforcement mechanism. For us, the decision to behave morally is enforced by a feeling of discomfort or fear of social rejection or guilt about hurting another person. For the psychopath, that enforcement mechanism is non-existent, leaving only the pure calculus of risk versus reward.
This idea that the inability to feel fear of emotional consequence leads directly to the ability to inflict it without remorse. That is the most profound takeaway from this deep dive for me. So this deep dive into the psychopathic brain, it really reveals that the human quest for empathy, for compassion, for community, it's all rooted in these highly specific biological structures and neural circuits. It's not vague, you can quantify it.
To briefly summarize the primary findings then. First, we have that structural difference, the 18% reduction in the amygdala's volume, found by Dr. Yang and colleagues. But critically, the primary deficit is functional. It's the breakdown, specifically the dysfunctional wiring with the prefrontal cortex.
Which creates that critical absence of an emotional response to external suffering.
Precisely.
So the key insight we have to carry forward is this. The subtle difference in the functionality of this small almond-shaped structure ultimately determines who we classify as use, a protected person worthy of empathy, and who is considered just a tool in the grand social game.
It is the engine that generates the emotional boundary of community. And if that boundary mechanism is broken, the ability to prioritize well-being of another person, which is, the foundational moral principle of human society, is simply not generated by the brain. It's a physiological explanation for the most antisocial behaviors we observe.
That leaves us with a really challenging thought, building on the source material's conclusion about in-group classification. Our brains are constantly deciding who is us, who we protect, who we value, who we fear. So, given that our capacity for humanity seems so biologically tied to our ability to classify and emotionally protect the us, what are the profound societal implications when that classifying engine breaks down so completely that the us category is biologically, structurally, and functionally empty?
It compels us to appreciate that empathy isn't some ethereal philosophical concept. It's a measurable neurological circuit. And once that circuit fails, the fundamental emotional requirement for human connection is just severed. It forces us to ask, if their brain genuinely lacks the mechanism to feel connection, how do we, as a society, establish external constraints to replace the internal ones that nature failed to provide?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the brain's architecture of empathy and exploitation. We hope this is giving you a new, highly detailed perspective on just how complex and how vital those tiny structures really are.